Welcome, folks, to Software Sales Simplified, Move to Success, the podcast for software sales professionals who want to get better. Whether you're a seasoned pro or just getting started, tune in right here to get your advice on how to advance your career, get better skills, and sell better. Hopefully, you've been here before. For those who are joining for the first time, welcome to the podcast. My name is Kevin Donville. I am your co-host. My partner in crime is Matt Long. Matt Long, go ahead and give us a quick wave there. We're joined today by a wonderful guest, Geoff Galat. Geoff Galat has been the chief marketing officer for a number of different companies that both Matt and I have worked at in the past. And he's here today to share some of his pithy and whimsical observations of the sales market. Geoff, go ahead and introduce yourself to the audience, please.
It's kind of funny to be the CMO and a marketing guy and being invited to be on a sales effectiveness podcast, because as you guys have probably heard me say before, that the fundamental difference, in my opinion, between sales and marketing is marketing knows when we're lying. But that said, as you both know, and I've spent a lot of time in my career and have a lot of pride in trying to help the selling process, that, I don't believe marketing exists in a vacuum. Marketing exists for one purpose at all, and it's to help somebody sell something and hopefully help somebody buy something. So it's exciting to me to be part of this and hopefully be able to help some people out.
Well, you've certainly been helpful to me and inspirational and mentor to me in many different roles that I've had over the last 20 some odd years in the software space. Although you and I don't go back quite that far, but pretty doggone close. From that perspective, I kind of wanted to ask you a quick question with respect to selling these days. And we've been at this for a long time. You've been more on the marketing side. What's the thing that's changed the most in the last few years? Because people are saying that selling these days is harder than it's ever been in the past, and the market has changed. The way people sell it changing. What do you think are some of the biggest changes in the market right now?
Yeah, there's been a bunch of them. And, as you know, because we've done a lot of selling engagements together. I've always prided myself on being part of the selling process. I think that was part of my role really in being a CMO, was not sitting around day to day saying, hey, what's the conversion rate on this lead generation program? I had other people doing that. So I was involved in selling because it was the best window into information I could possibly get on what resonated and what didn't. So I have been involved in selling. And I think that from my perspective, a couple of things that have really changed dramatically over time. One is that it's much more rare that you get in front of a customer, and you certainly don't get in front of a customer multiple times necessarily, to bring in layers of other people, including executives like myself, to help articulate a value proposition. I think it's much more there's more immediacy in the selling process, more let's make it happen faster today. I think part of that is the reality is that most people today are buying software as a service. We go back to the days when we first started working together, when we were selling perpetual license software. So we had to go and sell it to somebody. We had to install it. To even get to the point where we could install software to do a proof of concept required major investment on the customer side in time and money, security involvement, all sorts of other pieces to even get installed to determine whether or not something was valuable. And as you pointed out earlier, when you and I were having a conversation, that today I can pretty much download just about anything. I can do my own evaluation. I don't need to go through that process, which means I also, in my mind, don't think I need to bring people in like you and me. I don't think I need to bring people in. I think it's a bit of a naive thing, and I think it's going to shift back over time because everything shifts back over time. So I think that's a big one. I think that there's less of, there's the selling process that we've all been involved in. And we build out a process, and you built out your framework, the MOVE framework of how to help someone through the selling process. I think sometimes we forget that customers have a buying process, and the selling process has to align to the customer's buying process. And I think that that's changed. The customer buying process used to be, well, what's the problem we're going to solve? What's the problem that we have? Great. Now I need to go figure out how I'm going to try and solve it. So what do? I go to Google, I go somewhere else. I talk to some friends at the industry. I go to a trade show. I ask people that I know and that I trust, hey, how did you solve the problem or something similar? And you get all these varying voices that come in. Mm-hmm. Today, what do you do in that scenario? Maybe you go and look at a couple of Forrester or Gartner reports, but I don't even think that's that common anymore. I think you do a quick Google search. I think Google, and by its nature now, as we've seen more and more things like AI entering into the search process, it's going to give you a set of results. You're going to say, well, that sounds interesting. Let me go look at that. You find out that it's a company that sells via product-led growth, and I can download it. I don't need to get approval. I don't have to sit in front of a sales guy. I don't have to be told anything. I can buy it. The most recent company that I worked for is a company that sold a solution to help companies with usage-based pricing for product-led growth. So you download it. I'm not even selling it to you. And as you use it, we're going to bill you as you use it without a sales process even being involved. That's a fundamental change, right? A completely fundamental shift in how things happen. I think, COVID, even though we're 5 years on from the beginning of COVID, right? We went from every sales call was in person. We were on site all the time. We all spent our careers on airplanes, right? To this kind of a conversation. And this kind of a conversation is a different kind of a conversation. It depends on, if I'm selling you something, as opposed to us having a conversation today about how people sell, if I was trying to sell you something, the dynamics of that conversation are so very different than if we're in a room together. Your attention span is different. You don't look at your email while we're having a conversation if I'm in the room with you. Although, as we all learned with, BlackBerries and iPhones and everything over the course of my career, people did still do that. But that changed the dynamic there too, because the idea of the relationship aspect of the selling process that used to be really, really critical differed because the relationship was across a screen from hundreds or thousands of miles away. So I think those are the big ones. And I think that they all kind of work in concert to make things very different. Now, one other thing I think that I used to be, when we go back to our days of selling perpetually licensed enterprise class software, those were big ticket items. We're talking $300,000 to $500,000, $1 million, $10 million. That's a major budgetary process, and someone's really got to go through and cross every T and dot every I in an evaluation. And sales engineers would come in and install software and guide results, and you'd have to present and present and present. But you sold it once. And as long as the software did what you sold it to do, it was just renewing it every year. And you're able to move to the next customer. That's totally different now. I mean, I think that, you guys experience this. I've experienced this, where the barrier to entry of software as a service is so low in terms of buying. Even if I say, even if I go through the process, say it's more than product-led growth, I decided what solution I want, and I'm going to buy something. It's $20,000, $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 for the first year. To us, that's a lot of money. To an enterprise, that's not a lot of money. And I'll evaluate it at the end of the year and determine whether or not it was successful or not. And that is a big fundamental difference, right? The barrier to entry. So, the first year of any solution is really a proof of concept, or we used to do proof of concepts that took weeks. Companies sort of self-guide themselves through a proof of concept now, and it can take a year, and they're not actually very equipped to do that.
Right.
Do you find that there's a price point or level complexity where people are more willing to engage with the seller, or are they still doing a lot of investigation on their own and willing to start off on these things maybe half-baked?
I think I'm not sure it's a price point thing, Matt. I think it's a value proposition thing. And it's if they recognize that the problem set that they're trying to solve is a really complex one that they need guidance with. And I'm going to use the term with a seller very much as a caveat. As we all know, and no offense to salespeople, I love them. I've made my career off them. People want to engage with somebody who's going to help them figure out a problem solution. They don't really want to be sold. They want to buy. So I'm not sure that it's as much, I think if it's a simple problem you're trying to solve, you think in your mind, I can solve it. I have expertise. If it's a complex problem, some of the ones that we dealt with in our careers, there's no way when you think about the stuff that we sold that somebody could just turn them loose with the software and they'd figure it out.
Oh, people tried. And
correct.
And how many times were they successful? Generally speaking, not very.
Not very. So I think it's a complexity thing more than it is a price point thing. I think if you're solving a really complex problem, now, you could argue no one's building inexpensive software to solve really complex problems. So it might be a self-propagating thing. Yeah, I'm not sure that it's as much that. I think it's more people think that because of the availability of tools and information that they don't have to engage with a seller. I think what they end up finding out is that by not engaging with a seller and a selling team, and with after sales service and support and value proposition delivery, they're going to struggle because they don't have the ability to do what they think they have the ability to do. I think they think they're smarter than they really are.
Yeah, and I think that leads to something as well. It's like, it's not just about buying the product and getting that implemented. It's like, how are you going to be working with this company going forward, right? And part of the who you meet in the sales process is, do I trust these people to be there with me when things go apeshit? It's like, when things go wrong, is this company going to be there for me, right?
And I think that's where you get into, if you think about, if it's a mission critical software solution you're selling, that's really critical. That's really important, right? Because there's a lot of things out there that are sold that are kind of bet your business decisions. Well, bet your business decision. Do you just trust the mid-level guy you said, hey, go download this thing and install it and see if it really does, if it solves a problem you think you need to solve? I'm not sure I trust them. I mean, even going back to our days when we were together at Tealeaf, which is, 15 years ago, 12 years ago now, at the end, people would ask all the time. Their concern was less about our technical capability to problem solve. They were concerned about, are we viable enough as a company for them to do business with?
Definitely.
That's a big one here, because I think that's one of those, that if you're selling to any industry that's reliant on the solutions, that's what they worry about more than they worry about, does it, they will sometimes settle for a lesser solution if they have more trust that the company's going to be there longer.
That's where something you had said a little bit earlier on, to me, really stands out. And it's something I think a lot of people fail to engage properly in the sales process. And that's understanding their ability to act. So they've got the need, but do they have the opportunity? Can they actually act on this? There were a lot of things you touched on over that last thing that kind of tie into that, the dependence on AI for their research and the failure to properly engage. Where do you think now? Do you think now with the smaller transactions which have a lesser investment, do you feel there still is the requirement to get to that level of understanding with the customer? And do you think tools like AI are getting in the way? And then I'd love to get Matt's take on some of this, because I know this is a topic that's near and dear to his heart.
I mean, I'll jump in. I think it's even more critical. I think that I think that people, for whatever reason, in their minds, think of software as a service or cloud-based service, whatever you want to call it, cloud-based offerings. They think of them through the prism that they're managed services. I'm buying the solution, and some companies now, and it's probably even worse now with AI proliferating, because they buy the solution and say, well, now it's got AI in it. So just kind of, it'll figure out what to do. I'll tell it what to do. But they believe, I think, really naively that just, you buy software, you download the software, you install the software, and it's panacea. I think the fundamental disciplines that have existed forever still exist, is that no one gets value out of any software, unless they invest the time and the resources into making it actually function. So I think they think they're getting a managed service. Oh, I signed up for, even the biggest player in the industry is Salesforce.com, right? We've all used it forever. They invented software as a service, right? They invented the whole idea. There are massive consultancies that have been built up over time around Salesforce.com simply to make it do the things that they say that it does when you read a data sheet. Or if you read their data sheet's probably an old term, but if you read their website. I made an entire career out of writing stuff and saying things about software that kind of stretched the boundaries of what it really did, right? It did what it did. I never lied about it, but we never said it did it on its own.
Right.
We said, you'll solve this problem, and we have tools that'll help you solve this problem. The dirty little secret underneath that was, it's going to take people like you guys. It's going to take people on the post-sales consulting side. It's going to take investment in your own people. They don't have their own people, right? In fact, part of the budgetary process is we don't need to have our own people if we get this software that's going to magically do anything for us. And I think it's an oxymoron. So, I think that's my perspective on it. I'd love your thoughts, Matt.
Yeah, I think one of the things that made me successful as a software seller was not being able to demonstrate the value of the solution, et cetera, but really paint the picture about how this would actually be implemented successfully and inculcated into the organization, right? And it really is about building a practice.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is a salesperson doesn't want to say that because that sounds hard and sounds like a lot of work.
Right.
And the fact is, it is, right? But, there's so many times I think there's a disconnect between it's so easy. You install it, it integrates automatically with a couple of clicks, and then you're up and running, right? That's the sales. And then you have to come in afterwards like, well, yes, that connects you, but then you do this, right? And I think savvy executives, though, as I got further in my career, I started realizing that the top executives didn't really care what it did. They figured out their team could figure that out. What they cared about is I do not want to pay $1 million for something and have it go unused. Right. And 6 months from now, we're like, what happened to that? It's like, well, we ran these problems, it's not working, et cetera. So I devoted a lot of my time towards the end of my career on just helping them understand this is how it's going to be implemented. This is how it's going to be stood up. These are the teams involved on your side,
Right,
that you're going to have to get involved to make this thing happen. And if they balked on that, I'd really push back and say, well, what do you think the value of the solution is going to be for you?
Yeah, totally
Right?
agree.
Yeah.
I think that people back when we were selling software on boxes, right, selling on-premise software, people viewed they rationally looked at what the total cost of ownership on a solution was. And they said, well, we're probably going to have to spend as much on hardware and hardware related things as we do on software. So essentially, if your price is $1 million, it's going to cost me $2 million, just making up numbers. I think when cloud-based offerings came to play, they said, great, we eliminate a huge chunk of that whole piece of it. But I think there was actually a third level of that entire equation that never came up in the selling process, which was it was probably a third of the money was going to go to hardware, a third of the money was going to go to software, and a third of the money was going to go to people and process. So they eliminated the one, but they thought that the software piece was going to solve the other two. And I think, you used a term, and I wanted to jump on it. It's why I interrupted you, which is when you get to the executives. And I think that's one of the hardest parts today, because the availability of the software in ways that doesn't require executive buy-in means that lower level people can gatekeep the executives much better than they used to be able to. They've always tried to gatekeep from the executives. However, if I know going in, if I'm working in a company and I'm doing an evaluation, I know I got to spend $1 million. I know I can't sign for it. And I better get Matt and Kevin involved because they're the guys up my food chain that can sign for that. If it's $30,000 or $40,000 in a year, I might just need to get Kevin. Well, at the end of the day, Matt's the person who's the real ultimate one. Matt's the one who logically would look and go, hang on. What's the process? How are we going to get value out of this thing? What's going to be delivered? I might not ever get to that level. And then what do, right? As sellers, we get late in the process. We think something's going sideways, or even worse, we get at the end of the first year of ownership and we have to renew. And now we come back and you call me and I go, we don't use it that much. And you call Kevin and Kevin says, well, I sort of stay out of it. Jeff does everything over in his group, and he tells me we don't use it that much. And the seller immediately goes, I got to get to Matt. He's the guy who can oversee this. The problem is he's never met Matt. He's never had to talk to Matt. Matt's totally disengaged from the thing at this point. Now he call up and go, that thing you bought? No. Oh, here's what you bought. Here's what it's supposed to do for you. I understand your guys aren't getting that out of it, but I want you to renew it, right? To bring it in. That's a tough value proposition as a seller to try and step into.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a good transition point too, because we talked about it earlier. I like to kind of dig in a little bit deeper, but because it's SaaS and it's generally year contracts, usually, I mean, everyone pushes for it, get a 3-year, but it's really rare that you can get that done, right? Especially on the first signature. But what does that look like now? Because a lot of times as sellers in the past, we would sell, hand it over and move on, right, to the next opportunity. But now I find that we need to be engaged the entire year, because if we don't, it's going to churn. And now they're even starting to put some of your incentive and things based upon a retention. as well, but you're not touching it. So it's really interesting how it's been shifting, but I don't think sales processes and compensation has caught up to it necessarily everywhere.
Yeah, I think there's a bunch of factors. I think you're dead on. That I've talked to a number of executives, some of whom I've developed really strong relationships over many years, friends, and they tell me that they view every cloud-based solution purchase as a 1-year POC. So that's just the starting point. Like we can buy anything for a year. And in the course of the year, we're going to determine whether or not it does what it does, just like we just described, or I just described. The problem is that's not the way software, that's the buying process, right? Not selling process. So what we do as sales organizations, what are we largely set up as? We've got a pre-sales side and a post-sales side. We have we have sales reps, whatever you want to call them, and then we have account managers. So the one guy handles sales before the deal is done, and the other one handles it afterwards. And you have sales engineers whose job is to demonstrate value going up front. And then at the back end, you have customer solutions people who are supposed to deliver consulting value or whatever it is that's included. As we all know, those handoffs don't necessarily happen that cleanly. They're different incentives to the point you were making. The sales guy, I made the comment to Kevin, he said he'd never heard it. We were chatting the other day. I used to joke all the time that salespeople buy cars that don't have rear view mirrors on them, right? They don't want to look backwards. I sold my deal. I drive to the next deal. I don't have to look back because you know what? It's now account management's problem. I'm going to move to the next one. Well, that doesn't really work anymore. And the problem and the handoff doesn't happen instantly. So if you're on a 365-day clock from the day you sign a deal, so say you sign a deal on January or December 31st, right? When, probably 70% of software deals historically have gotten signed December 31st. That means January 1st, when everybody's on vacation, by the way, the 365 clock starts. And it's really not a 365-day clock because it's probably more like a 180-day clock because
right.
At some point, someone's going to look up and go, hey, what are the deals that are going to renew this coming December 31st? Which ones are at risk? Who's been engaged with that one? Does anybody have any intelligence on this account? And unless they picked it up day one and started with day one saying, okay, here's exactly what we sold as value. Here's exactly how we're delivering on that value. And I'm comfortable they're going to renew. We find ourselves picking up a bunch of broken pieces somewhere along the way. And the incentives are different, right? Their incentive is just to get that deal done. The sales rep's incentive was just to get the first deal done. Who's actually looking at is the customer getting value out of it? And what is it? What is a typical sales rep? And in the best environments I've ever been in, any sales rep is really capable of 3 to 5 enterprise level deals on any given quarter. What's the workload on account managers? They ain't 3 to 5 accounts, right? So they've got 15 salespeople's 3 to 5 per quarter. They have to onboard and get up and going in that. So it might take them, even if they could do one a day, it's going to take them 20 days counting, to be. So now you're on January 30th, probably really before you're actually getting going. That window just keeps shrinking and you don't give them all the same attention, right? There's bigger ones and smaller ones. There's salespeople you like and salespeople and I mean there's all those. Okay, it's a tough thing to deal with, and I think that the process needs to be a 360-degree over time process, not just a sales and account management process. It needs to be an overall account process.
Right. Where have you seen it work well? Because these are things I've struggled with almost every company, that I've been at. And there's been things that have worked better than others, but have you seen it actually in a place that's been organized and considered well and actually executed on?
Honestly, not really.
I've worked a few places where it has been successful. And, what I've seen that works is reflected in that part of our methodology, which is E for engagement, which is the last stage of it. And it really hits on the things you were just talking about, Geoff, which is the whole thing about there's these different groups. There's really 4 different groups that are involved in the purchasing, deployment, use, and evaluation of a piece of software. The selling team, deployment and delivery team, the buyer, and the user, right? 2 of them on either side two of those groups are on either side of that equation. And the communication between those four groups and the exchange of information and the responsibilities that are owned and need to be navigated by all four sides in those two different departments really is going to dictate whether or not something is going to be successful. Because to your point, there's the person who bought the software. They had their ideas. They had the solution that they wanted to see fixed. There's their big challenge. That's why they gave you $1 million. And then there's people who are going to use it. Who is going to be the first group that the services delivery team, the team responsible for delivering on that promise to the buyer, who are they going to talk to? They talk to the user. They may have a very different set of criteria that may or may not dovetail effortlessly with what the buyer wanted. So that communication and that exchange of what do we really need to deploy here needs to start before the contract's actually inked. Yep. And then the renewal starts day one while the ink's still wet. And that's where the delivery needs to map in both directions, and the delivery team needs to communicate with the sales team about what they're seeing. Are we delivering? Are there other things that they should be aware of? Other things they should be using us for? What additional value can we deliver?
Yeah, and there are ways, I mentioned that the company that I was working with, that we were doing usage-based pricing, usage-based billing. So we had real data about who was using what and how often, because that's what you were paying based upon. But there's the gain sites of the world that people can get some sense of a dashboarding of going on. But data is only data, right? Data is as good. It's garbage in, garbage out, right? And it depends on what you're measuring. And data doesn't ever measure politics. It doesn't ever mention priorities inside a company. I think your point, I'll come up with an example. I'm not sure, to answer your question, Matt, I'm not sure I've seen a company that programmatically across the board solved the problem. I have seen examples within probably every company I've ever worked with where certain teams have solved the problem really, really well. I'll use one as an example. One of the more recent ones for me was the team you were on in the Pacific Northwest, where we had a very major account and we had ownership of that account. We had an account owner who owned that account, pre-sales and post-sales. And he had a team of people that worked on the account, pre-sales and post-sales. He wasn't thinking about, I'm going to go, who's the next big account I'm going to solve? Because his entire job was essentially that account. Now, he had a couple of other ones, but it was that same model, that major accounts approach. That can be really successful, because then a major accounts, you say, look, I lead the major account. I have these resources pre-sales. I have these resources post-sales. I'm going to take ownership. I'm going to have the relationships. I'm going to help manage that whole thing he becomes a disintermediator, right? He's able to do that whole thing and solve that whole problem or that whole process in a greater way. It's much harder when you don't have that level of account ownership, which you can't have across every account, right? You'd never be in business if you dedicated that level of resource on every customer. Now, if I'm not selling to the enterprise, if I'm a company that's in business and I don't sell to the enterprise, that model's never going to work. And I've got to come up with a different model. And that different model is probably one, if I was to structure it, if it were me coming into a company leading growth and they said to me, how would you structure what we do? I would not have a pre-sales and post-sales component. I would say we have an ownership component. Now, you might own 10 accounts, you might own 20 accounts, and I would argue that I need to have a pre-sales team and a post-sales team, essentially, or a consulting organization that can handle both pre-sales and post-sales needs. And in a product-led growth world, the pre-sales needs are lesser than the post-sales needs, right? If somebody's going to download and self-install, I don't necessarily have to have the same level of pre-sales engagement of, going and recoding something or installing something or going through security reviews and all the stuff that pre-sales typically ends up having to do. If I can minimize that and just focus them on just value delivery, then they're essentially acting like post-sales anyways. So you could have one group there, but it's a big problem for people to solve. I think people need to get their arms around how do you shift that, and it probably is dependent on who you sell to, value, cost of your solution, where you sell, et cetera.
Right. I think where I've had the most success, where I'm not retaining the ownership of the account necessarily, was, obviously a good handoff. And I think, Kevin, this would actually be a good podcast for the future about that handoff document and process, because that's something I worked a lot on. I'd like to share some about that a little bit later. But after that handoff, at least quarterly, checking in with a QBR or something so that you're still engaged with that customer and driving the value that they're getting. Or if they're not, putting it back on track, because it gets off track so easily, and it's no fault of the account manager or anything. So when we were still involved from a sales perspective, but from a sales lens, let me put it that way, right? Of like, how's this going? What value are you getting? Where do you want to go? And keep driving it forward. Then there are no more surprises, 90 days before renewal that they were not getting value, right? And we were able to mitigate it and deal with it during the course of the year, so that we're much more successful with the renewal and even an upsell, perhaps.
Yeah, great example of that, Matt. When we were together at Clicktale, when we were all together at Clicktale, we had a major account based in Atlanta, which is where I live. So I got involved in the account more as, I was a local executive presence, and I was able to be there fairly often. And so we would do a QBR with them. And it was really funny because as a team would prep going into the QBR, we would all sit around and say, where are we with the issues that bubbled up? Where are we in solving the problems? And there's always, in software, right? It's always got problems. There's always issues. We would have a laundry list of the things, and here, and the post-sale side and the support side would say, here's where we are on those. Here's the ones we've cleaned out, et cetera, et cetera. Here's the open ones. These are going to be the big issues when you go into the QBR. We document it all. We go in the QBR. And QBR is not with those guys. The QBR is with the business owner, the head of digital. So we go into the room with the head of digital, and we're all prepared with this whole list because he's going to beat the hell out of us over this whole list of stuff. You've got all these SEV ones and everything. Care less. To the point you made earlier, he didn't know about them. His team obfuscated them from him, probably because it reflects on them to a certain degree too. He wanted to know, what's our vision? Where are we going next? What other things are we going to do? They were in process, they're like any other company. They're like, I'm going back, whatever it is, 7-8 years now. We're going all in on mobile. Where are you guys on mobile? Well, that had nothing to do with start solving the SEV1 bug that is happening now. We're going all in this. We're doing location-based. What are you doing on location-based? How can you define that? None of the stuff that bubbled up in our prep from account management, it was all strategic stuff that, again, the buyer's process versus the seller's process, all the things that were driving his thinking going forward. He assumed that we were going to solve the things we were going to solve. We'd proven to him that we were good at solving problems that bubbled up. So now he's like, okay, you've proven that. Help me with where do we go with this? Because I didn't just buy you for one thing. I bought you as an investment over time. And it was really interesting. So I think you're dead on with having those communications have to happen at multiple levels, right? And there you get to the interesting conundrum. Even with the account manager, is the account manager of the, have the business acumen or presence to be able to have that meeting with that person?
Right.
Because if they don't, that's an issue, right? And they either bring in other resources, or you have to upscale what they do to make them capable of being able to sit down and have that conversation.
Yeah, and we should just mention a QBR is a quarterly business review for those that don't know. Sorry if we use some of this jargon, but basically it's a time to kind of get together with the executives as well as the people that are managing the project and talk about where you are, where you're going, et cetera. And it can vary in terms of what you cover, but I think to Geoff's point, a lot of times the executives don't care about the minutia of how the project's going. They want to know what's the value we're getting and what continued value are going to be receiving from this.
And I think one of the things, going back to the comment I made at the very beginning about how the process has changed over the last few years, I mentioned I did those QBRs in person because I happened to be based there. Other people flew in for it. I think a lot of those QBR, you guys jump in if you're closer to this than I am today. I think a lot of those QBRs happen this way too now, because teams are dispersed, they're remote, there's a lot of reasons. And then you have a difficult challenge when you're in the QBR because you're trying to meet both needs. You do have the person in the room, because being online and a Zoom is easy. You have the person in the room who does want his SEV1 bug fixed. And you've got the strategic guy over here and you got an hour or 2 hours, and you're trying to have those two conversations in parallel, that's really challenging too. So I think that strategically, advice to the account manager or the account ownership would be find a way to disconnect those. Have a technical session QBR and a business section QBR, but don't let the streams cross, using Ghostbusters speak.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. Let's look back to some of the things you brought up earlier on in our conversation. Nowadays, people are a lot of the solutions that we're hearing about are more simplified solutions that people are downloading and trying to engage on their own. How do you establish this degree of understanding and communication of value and success in the new world order that we see in front of us?
Yeah, it's really hard. I think I told you this, but was working with a company as the CMO, small company. I knew everybody. I knew all the customers. So we have an analyst who's writing a report about us, and they say, well, I need to talk to a couple of customers. So we have a couple of really successful customers, and I'm also not in the minutia day to day with the support teams and other people. I just heard, hey, these two customers are really doing well with the solution. Use them, and they've agreed to be referenceable. That's all I need to hear, right? So I go out and I say, yeah, here's these customers. They're both referenceable. They both bought more stuff from us. They're happy. They seem to be doing great. So I have this analyst talk to them, and I have a good relationship with the analyst. We've known each other for a long time, and he calls me up afterwards and says, I said, hey, how'd those interviews go? And he goes, well, they were frustrating, which is not what I wanted to hear, right? And I said, well, why were they frustrating? And he said, well, because neither of them really uses your software. I don't. And he goes, you guys do it all for them. They're really happy and successful because your consulting team pretty much solves all their problems for them. They have an issue, we solve it. They need a new process set up, we do it. That's great. It doesn't scale at all, right? And it goes back to the couple of points we made earlier, like they've had to make zero investment in their own resources to get anything going forward with this. Difficult to ever model that to another customer when the customer says to you, what do you need to do? So it's another microcosm of that same exact thing, right? And this is, I think, one of those things that becomes challenging in this cloud-based world. Like when I said it earlier, that I think a lot of people expect cloud-based services to actually be managed services. That's what we were doing. It was a managed service. We were doing all the work. That doesn't scale. It's not a successful business model. VCs and other people who invest in companies are like, why do you need 50 services people when for what your revenue is? Yeah, because we're doing all the work because no one else knows how to do it. And it's a bit of an indictment on product too, right? It's an indictment on the product side. Like if it's so complex to use the product that the only people that can use it is us, that's a problem too. So I do think there's a dynamic there that is a challenging one. So, if the software, again, it goes back to how complex is the problem that you're trying to solve?
I worked for a software company once where there was a button that said, after you selected some options, it said run report, right? And you click that button and it took a while, right? And in a day you got your report. What that did is it sent an email to a consultant on our team that would then generate the report and email it to them. When I found that out, I was like, what else are they not telling me about the software I'm selling? It's like,
yeah, what was it? Staples used to have the easy button. That was the easy button, right? Well, we just push this red button and it magically happens.
Do you think with, the new thing, the buzzword, everyone's baking AI into their solutions now. And with respect to the more complicated problem that you're trying to solve, how do you think AI being wrapped into those solutions changes that conversation, both for the people who are trying to sell the product and the people who are trying to make the product?
It's a great question. I think for the people who's trying to sell the product, it becomes a selling easy button. Oh, we've got AI baked into the product. If you have a difficult time or process or you have a question or whatever, we'll figure it out.
That assumes that they've done it right, and it actually does.
How rooted in reality that is.
Exactly.
Your biology may vary. I think part of it is, at the end of the day, AI is only as good as how AI is trained. Right? You train the models, you train the learning models, and what do you train them on? You generally train them on the most common things that happen, right? That's how they get trained, is they get trained off common. Common isn't usually the thing that breaks, or common usually isn't the thing that is problematic. It usually ends up being the edge case, right? We've all experienced it, right? 99% of our stuff worked great. We had this 1% of stuff that just broke all the time. Well, why? Well, because no one ever tested it. Well, why didn't they ever test it? Because it's an edge case. So unless the AI, whatever's training the AI, is smart enough to be able to figure out what the edge cases are going to be, and by the nature of the fact that they're an edge case means you didn't expect them to happen, I think it's still going to be a gap. I think there's still going to be a hole there. Now, over time, that might be an early implementation. 5 years from now, when all the edge cases have been trained back into the model, I mean, all the edge cases, every time you develop something new, there's edge cases, right? But, it might be better then than it is now. But I mean, anybody who, just go use for your own purposes, go type something into ChatGPT. You can manipulate it pretty easily because it only knows what it knows. And I haven't looked at it in a couple of years, probably a year. I typed my own name into ChatGPT, just ChatGPT, to see what it came up with. And it came back and told me that I was one of the original product designers of the iPhone at Apple.
Nice.
I'm guessing that if I really was, well, I know I wouldn't be paying as much as I paid for my iPhone, and I probably wouldn't be on this podcast with you guys. No offense. So, it only knew, it learns. And at that point, it was learning from, I grew up in Cupertino or near Cupertino. I'm not sure it's like Divine. There was probably somebody whose name was similar to mine. It added that stuff together. If I did the search now, it's probably a lot smarter than it was then. I would not give that as an answer, but that's an indicator. It only knows what it knows, and it only knows what the information sources it can gather them from are. So the promise of it is phenomenal. As a marketer, if you said to me that I could, in a simple way, find the segment of people most likely to buy my solution and find the segment of those people that have the top level problems that I'm trying to solve, and then give me a way to smartly use language to target them, that could save an inordinate amount of time in building campaign, and then be able to, if it's tied into my campaign platform, be able to push a button to create that segment and send out the campaign and then measure everything coming back. That sounds phenomenal. And that is kind of what most of the marketing platforms are sort of saying that they can do, including the analysis of what's working and not working. I'm not in it hands-on day to day to know if they really are or not, but my gut feeling is there probably are gaps, would be my guess. Probably better than it used to be, but there are probably gaps.
So incrementally, we're getting there little by little. There's the promise versus the reality.
Yeah. And how much, I guess, as we all learned a week or so ago with the announcement of DeepSeek, right? I mean, I think part of the problem has been how much computing infrastructure does it need to solve every little problem, to get enough learning, to have enough learning of the LLMs to be able to solve the problem. I don't think one of the takeaways from DeepSeek was, well, maybe not as much as people have been claiming that it did. I don't know. But I think that's part of it too, is like, how much is it worth an entire data center in the middle of rural Georgia to solve the edge cases for a software company that sells a couple $100 million a year of software? Probably not. And at what cost? So I think that's going to be just an interesting thing to determine in terms of, I think that when you look at the HubSpots of the world, their cost dynamic goes up dramatically if they have to have this massive AI infrastructure behind them to basically just do better at what they do. Because we're not actually saying you're going to do something different. We're just saying you're going to do what you've always done. You're just going to do it better. So it's an incremental feature, but at a massive cost potentially.
Do you think that that's going to spur some sort of culling? Because you're seeing a proliferation of AI solutions and tools. Do you foresee a culling of that population here in the next little while because of that, or for some other reason?
Well, I don't know. I don't look closely at things like Gartner hype cycles anymore. But if you're familiar with a Gartner hype cycle, it shows the early adoption stage and everything comes up, and then you hit the top peak And then there's what's called the trough of uncertainty, where everything drops off and the sales of something, when in actual practice, things aren't delivering what they're supposed to deliver and it drops off and then it comes back. I don't know where we are from an AI. Kind of want to believe we're at the front end of that curve. There will be a fall off. What's going to happen? I would assume there's going to be consolidation in the market, right? I mean, I don't think can't be 100 small companies all doing AI plugins and AI componentry. So that'll consolidate out. I joke, but going back to our old history, it's funny when we were at Tealeaf and we got acquired by IBM in 2012. So hard to believe, 13 years ago. At the time, IBM bought us. They bought a bunch of other software solutions. They also had a big hardware business and a big chip foundry business. And they sold those two things away, got rid of them entirely because software is where it's at. The world doesn't need this. Everything's software. Can you imagine? What are the most profitable company in the world right now is NVIDIA. All they are is a chip foundry. And everybody else is selling bucket loads of servers with those chips in them to host all these AI apps. So IBM had this ability back then, if they had been forward thinking enough, which I don't think anybody really was in 2012, to say, no, we need to keep those things because then we can own hardware, software, and the chip foundry, all three, and own that whole thing. I think there's going to be consolidation. There has to be. And, the problem is in today's universe, what happens, does that mean that Google ends up owning 70% of it? That Apple owns 70% of it? Does, OpenAI own a bunch of it? Do, God forbid, other nefarious players own more of it? I don't know. But I don't think that, we even see it now, right? When I use AI, Apple Intelligence is ChatGPT under the covers on an Apple device, right? Apple didn't invest in building their own. They invested in integrating with one. I would assume that's what's going to happen. And I would assume that whole thing is going to consolidate over time. But I'm no analyst.
Well, I think there's a lot of discussion about AI and just trying to figure out where it pans out. My biggest thing is a lot of times it's useful. I'll put in a query or something in a product, et cetera, but I don't necessarily get the same response every time, right? And which understandable. Look, you could have two different people looking at a problem and come up with two different solutions, but the fact that it's not consistent and there's not one best solution is a little cause for concern, right? You still need to have a little bit of discerning edge on it in terms of having a human look at it and validate whether this is real or not, right? In terms of the results you're getting and the action to take.
I worked for a company in 2015, post Tealeaf, before Clicktale, named AGT International. And our business was very much AI based, mind you, 10 years ago now, 9.5 years ago. At the time, I didn't know anything about it. I was learning as much as I could learn and looking at it through the prism of a marketer, not through a technologist, right? At the time, I learned that there were really two different kinds of machine learning that were underneath AI. There's supervised machine learning and unsupervised machine learning. So supervised is you build a model, you tell it exactly the parameters of what you're looking for, you tell it exactly what the results ought to be, et cetera. And then there was unsupervised, which is what the LLMs ended up being, right? You just put a lot of stuff into compute and they're going to just scan off and continue to learn, and they're going to become their own version of the HAL 9000 from 2001: A Space Odyssey and not unlock the pod bay doors, Dave. And I think that's where that shift has happened. I don't know how. I'm sure there are people working. There's a rationalization that has to be happening at the technical side of that whole thing. The interesting thing is, what does it mean for users? Because that's really where, I don't know if you've seen them, but I crack up every time I see them. So, Salesforce has an ad campaign right now featuring Matthew McConaughey and Woody Harrelson, and they're talking about their AI. And then one of them is Matthew McConaughey in a clothing boutique trying on clothes, claiming that none of the clothes match his style because this clothing boutique doesn't use Agent Force, which is AI enabled to know what he bought and what he likes to pass. And I'm thinking to myself, do we really ever expect that an individual clothing boutique, is going to ever have access to that kind of information or have any need for it for somebody who comes in? And the other one is him at a restaurant where they sat him in the wrong seat. It's outside. It's raining. But they brought him shrimp and he doesn't eat fish, whatever it is. So I get it. They're trying to sell what the concept is to the individual. But when you think about it from a practical application perspective, this is Salesforce, the biggest software company in the world. That's the best examples they could give, right? It's not the example of, we plugged something in and found out, here's the way that here is egg production, to be topical at the moment. And we have an H5N1 egg or bird flu outbreak that's eliminated so many chickens, that's eliminated so much production, and could model out what is the volume of production that we can expect with the growth of this. What is the output? What are the target price ought to be for the eggs? Like that to me sounds like a logical extension of what you could do with AI. And I'm sure there probably are people doing that kind of a thing. But the way that they're marketing it is more like, at first I'm like, are they really like, who's watching a Super Bowl commercial and thinking about buying an AI-based solution? But the second part of it is that really the use case model that makes sense? Maybe it makes sense to some people. They go, oh, that's cool. Like they should know what I wear when I go into Macy's. And the person at Macy's is making minimum wage and they could care less what you wear. They just want to check you out and move on and go to lunch, right? That's my prognosticating or my yapping about it.
That was fascinating. We could do a whole show just on that, I think. We've been focusing a lot on things that have kind of gone wrong and sort of interesting trends that are kind of going in sideways motions. What do you think companies are doing better or right in 2025 than maybe they weren't doing as early as when you and I were last working together at our last iteration?
It's no longer the wild, wild west in terms of how they buy solutions. It might have shifted because of things like product-led growth and other things, but no one is just taking chances on things anymore. They understand, I think they do a better job, and they have analytics and other things to help them understand what works and what doesn't work and what the most pressing problems they have as a business are. They don't necessarily know how to solve them, but they know what the pressing problem. I mean, how many times did we have to sit in front of somebody and explain to them that they had a bad conversion rate? And then they would say, no, it's great at the top of the funnel. And we'd have to say, no, it was like your problem is at the bottom of the funnel. And we'd have to evangelize that. I don't think as much of that happens today. They're like, we have a problem at the bottom of the funnel. Help me solve that, right? I think they're smarter that way as one discrete example. And I think they're, anybody you're negotiating with to sell software to today, it is not the first time they bought software, which back in the day, oftentimes it was, or it was early software, or, they always bought from an IBM or from somebody because that's where they got everything. And, I think those things have changed. And I think for positive, I think companies are smarter about what they do. The downside of that might be that companies think they're smarter about what they do than they really are. Because if it's something that's not core to their business, if you're an automotive manufacturer, marketing is a small component of what you do. And selling online, for an example, is a really small component of what you do, but it's really important now. It's newer to them, right? They know how to procure stuff, but they don't necessarily know how to solve that. And they're at the whim of people like me and people like you guys, right? People like me who write stuff about what things do, and people like you guys who show them and talk to them and face-to-face about what things do. And that goes back to that whole selling process, right? So I think there's a difference between if you're a buyer or an evaluator, if that makes sense. Like if you know what you want to buy and you're much smarter. Like if you're replacing, I bought X solution, Y solution is out now, it's better than X solution was, I just need to negotiate and buy. They're much smarter at doing that. If it's somebody walking in the door and saying, hey, did you know that you have tooth decay? And they go, what's tooth decay? You go, well, 9 out of 10 dentists claim you have tooth decay. I never knew that. Really? Well, let me explain to you how toothpaste works. Great. Okay. Great. Now, how much energy have we spent explaining to them that they have tooth decay or the tooth decay exists, that they might have it, and how toothpaste works before you ever got a chance to say, well, your toothpaste was better than the other guy's toothpaste? That
sounds like the whole early career.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think that's really gone away if you're solving a problem they don't know they have. If you're solving a problem that they know that they have, then they're smarter about it. Now, on the flip side, if they don't know they have it, and you spend all that effort of doing what we did, all of us in our early career, and they go, great, thanks very much. And they walk over down the hall and they go, hey, Bob, go look into a bunch of solutions that do this and figure out which one's the right one. And then we get back in that trap we talked about earlier about, well, I found one, I can download it and put it in. And We just evangelize to them the existence of something that they've now determined is a problem. The change is that today they might be able to solve the problem without ever doing anything further with us. And, that's right. What's the number one thing salespeople have always? Qualifying stuff. Qualifying. That's a qualification problem. And, qualifying stuff, I've always said salespeople are really good at qualifying stuff in and not so good at qualifying stuff out. They always believe any little, I talked to Matt. Matt's the guy. Matt can get the budget. Matt thinks we're solving a problem that's really important to everybody else in the organization. I'm not going to lose sight of it. So I qualified him in. And then you find out, well, Matt doesn't have the power he said he did. They don't really have a budget. He's the only one who thinks they have the problem. And I'm like, yeah, I know, but I'll convince him. Well, now that's even harder because Matt might just go download the solution, plug it in, and go, yeah, you know what? I don't really have the problem. He might still have the problem. It's just he wasn't able to find it because he didn't know what he was doing with the solution.
Well, Geoff, I hate to say this, but we're coming up on the end of our time for this episode this week, which is a shame because I'd love to keep talking. Really enjoyed you coming on here and sharing everything that you had to share. We've got a couple of things we need to go and wrap up. We always go and make sure that anybody watching that they like, share, subscribe, whatever it is for the modality that they are watching us in today. Hopefully they enjoyed it. And if you did, make some comments, share your thoughts with us. And if there's other topics you'd like us to cover in the future, by all means, include those in the comments or reach out to us on the website and let us know what you guys are thinking there. We've got a couple of promotions going on right now. Right now, our book, Winning Faster, the Move Framework for Enterprise Sales Success, is right now we've got a special going on for the digital e-reader version. There is a coupon you guys can use, Sell Faster 2025, and you guys can get 25% off on the digital e-reader version of the book itself. And we hope that you guys come back and see us here again next week. But Geoff, farewell, sir. Really good. Matt, did you want to cover anything before we close up here today?
No, it's just really good to reconnect with you, Geoff. Always enjoy talking with you and look forward to speaking again.
Yeah, it was great. Thank you guys for having me on. And if you need anything else or anybody out there listening has any questions or comments, cycle them through Kevin and Matt, but I'm happy to help in any way that I can.
Yeah, Geoff has got a fantastic consultancy of his own. And of course, if you guys are interested in having someone coming in with reference to those QBRs, Matt and I have got a series of services and packages on our website as well. Go ahead and peruse those and let us know if we can come out and help your sales team, your pre-sales team, your services team become better at what it is that they do. But for now, folks, we're going to go and sign off. Thank you for tuning into Software Sales Simplified, Move to Success. This podcast is produced by and the sole property of Strategic Sales Optimization, LLC, copyright 2025. Reproduction or use of this podcast in whole or in part without the express written consent of Strategic Sales Optimization, LLC is strictly prohibited, all rights reserved. So thanks you folks for coming in and sharing with us. Have a great week.